Hello, my name's Zoe Enser, and I was putting together a presentation for a school that I'm working with around cognitive load in English, and a few people asked if I would mind perhaps sharing that more widely, and so I decided rather than linking it to all the things that I would talk to that department about, I would just strip it down a little bit and share some of my thinking around cognitive load theory and how it relates to English here. For those of you who don't know, my name's Zoe Enser, and I've been was an English teacher for over 20 years, and I'm now working across Kent with schools to explore their English curriculum and assessment and all sorts of wonderful things in relation to pedagogy too. So cognitive load theory in English and what that means. Well, I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with this particular version of how the mind works and the multi-store memory model, which is kind of the exploration from Atkinson and Shiffrin in 1968. This particular example of that, and there are a few different ways that this model is presented, comes from the wonderful Ollie Cav and his kind of presentations around the way that we think about things, the cognition, and how we store that information. And you can see on his diagram, we've got the environment and all of that information going in, which we know kind of occurs in many different ways, what we see, what we hear, and what we're experiencing, that kind of sensory side of things. But then the filtering through of that information that is most important, that we want for the learning, the processing that takes place in the working memory, which we know is quite a limited space if we want to think about it in those terms. But whatever's going on in that working memory, there are certain limitations on that, and that's probably what we really want to think about in terms of cognitive load theory. John Sweller, in particular, has developed ideas around cognitive load theory, thinking about this model, and he certainly is famed for it. And I would highly recommend also looking at Ollie Lovell's book about this in action. But this is kind of English in action and what it means to us. We want the information that we're giving our students to be processed, and we want it to be stored in the long-term memory. And there are a number of different ways that we can get them to do that. Obviously, to think about things generatively, to use a kind of a generative approach, working from the basis of Friarella and Mayer can be one way that we really get them to be processing that right information so things can be stored in that long-term memory. There's their interaction that takes place all the time as well between the working memory and the long-term memory. We draw on things in there in order to be able to process, and then we take things from our working memory that have been processed and store them in that long-term memory. So it's a real kind of cycle of information that goes in and is explored, and obviously then some information which is discarded is forgotten. Or at least is no longer swiftly and easily retrievable. And that's perhaps what we think about in terms of forgotten. Now, when we think about cognitive load theory, I think there probably are many myths, but I think one particular myth that stands out to me is the idea that all we need to do all the time is to reduce cognitive load, and cognitive load is a bad thing, it's a terrible thing, and it isn't desirable. Well, actually, we want cognition to take place. We want people to be thinking about things, and we do it all the time regardless. So what we want to think about though is what we want those students to be thinking hard about. What do we want them to focus in on? And certainly in the past, in my lessons, I haven't always necessarily been aware of that, and have then focus students on thinking about the right things. And that's what we want them to be able to do. They've got to focus in and think hard about the most important things that we want them to think about in order to be able to then problem solve and do all of the other kind of cognitive processes which are going to lead to them really being successful in our subject areas. And so it's not about just reducing cognitive load. It's not that, having cognitive load is bad. We hear about, my cognitive load is overwhelmed and don't ask me to do anything in a staff meeting because of my cognitive load. Well, actually, no, we want that kind of thinking to take place. And if you consider the Dan Willingham approach, then we want that memory to be the residue of thought. So we want them to think hard about things so they're more likely to remember things. So in Sweller, originally, he was exploring 3 different areas, the idea of intrinsic load, extraneous load, and germane load. I'm going to focus in really on intrinsic and extraneous because I think the other becomes a little bit more complicated and not necessarily as useful for us as educators. But certainly when we're thinking about intrinsic load, what we're talking about there from a cognitive point of view is the complexity of the task. What are we asking them to do? How much processing is going to be required? So for students of a certain level, if we ask them to do a simple mathematical problem of 1 + 1, they will know what that is. There isn't a particular complexity. However, if we go 1 + 1 + 6 + 10 + 5, then that becomes much more complex, and giving them new information or then expecting them to do all of that particular problem and then adding a multiplication problem in there when they haven't been taught how to do that, then we're giving them lots of new information at once, and then that places a higher cognitive load. That will be intrinsic to the task, though. We do want them to be thinking about that, but the load gets higher as the task gets more complex. In English, we'll see that in terms of the level of complexity of the task that we're asked, or the text that we're asking them to read. So there is going to be a significant difference in terms of the complexity of perhaps language analysis when we're comparing something like the bone sparrow, a really interesting text with a wealth of opportunity there. But in terms of the complexity of reading of the bone sparrow, that is obviously not as complex as reading Macbeth. So the complexity of the task and the complexity of the text and the ideas that we're giving to students, that's kind of intrinsic to the task. Now, if we take that mathematical example again, that 1 + 1, we'll see actually there's, that's only an easy task when there's certain prior knowledge there, when students have understood what that 1 and 1 represents, when they understand what plus means, whether that's different to add, whether they're seeing it written down in that particular way, or I'm saying 1 + 1. But they're drawing on that prior knowledge, that understanding of how that works. As I said before, if we then suddenly introduce the idea of multiplication in there, and they haven't experienced that, they'll try to draw on that prior knowledge, but they won't necessarily have it. So the intrinsic load in the task is going to be much more complex because they haven't experienced that before. If they've got a lot of prior knowledge of what we're asking them to do, so for example, if we're asking them to explore Macbeth, to take that text as an example again, if we're asking them to explore a passage from there, but they've actually studied the text in a lot of detail, they know about the characters, they've gone through language analysis on different extracts, they've built up to this particular point, that prior knowledge will mean that the load that we're expecting to place on their thinking and their working memory is going to be lessened. So prior knowledge is quite important, and making sure they can access that prior knowledge and that it's explicit that they have got that can be quite important. The more they're aware of they've gone through this process, the more familiar they are with that, and the more knowledge they've got about that, the better that will be. And we can introduce something much more complex because they've got that prior knowledge there. Also, the scaffolds that we give, that can change the intrinsic load of the task. Sometimes giving no scaffolds, so if we're asking them to write a descriptive piece and we've given them absolutely nothing around that, that means the intrinsic load, the thinking they're having to do around that, is going to be much higher. Now, that could be desirable. It could be one of those desirable difficulties that we hear a lot about from Bjork and Bjork, but actually, is that the appropriate level for those students? So when we're thinking about that intrinsic load, we need to consider those scaffolds. Do they need anything? Are we going for that text and that task without anything there, or are we going to put some scaffolding to support in order to be able to get them to do that? So a scaffold for a descriptive task, for example, might be some vocabulary. It might be going through that planning process together. It could be the teacher modelling. So there is a lot that you can do there to reduce the intrinsic load of that. Otherwise, it's very, very open. They'll be thinking lots and lots about it and not necessarily in the direction that we want them to go. And that's where the kind of extraneous load also is something to consider. It's everything that's outside of the task, extraneous to the need. But it still places pressure on working memory, and there can be lots and lots of things that do that. I just gave an example there. Sometimes scaffolding can actually get in the way and be adding too much. So if we've got lots of sentence starters and lots of vocabulary, we might think we're doing the right thing, but that might actually start to become extraneous to the load, and students will stop thinking about that. We see that perhaps with the use of acronyms like PEE and PEAS and PEAL. And the students, they stop thinking really deeply about Macbeth and the characters and analysing that. And they start instead thinking really deeply about, what does the P mean? What does the E stand for? What does the Z stand for? And it actually takes them away from the task. And remember, we want to make sure that we've got that real high quality focus on the important pieces of information and really thinking hard about those important pieces of information. Other aspects of extraneous load could be things like visual images. So I see lots of people, they love to have a really busy slide, and they love to have these images. They know that, oh look, the students will love seeing this little Lego man that's dancing, and it's going to be fantastic, and it's going to really excite them, and it's really going to engage them. And they might be right, they may well be highly engaged by the little dancing Lego figure. The problem is they've stopped thinking about Romeo because they're now looking at the little dancing Lego figure, and they're thinking about their own Lego experiences that they've had, and maybe they're thinking about the Lego movie. So all of a sudden, that one visual image has added all of this extraneous load. They're thinking and processing things that aren't necessarily adding to what we want them to be thinking about. The other area there is noises in the environment, and it's kind of moving us towards this divided attention. So with the visual images, they might be thinking about other things, but also noises in the environment, students talking, noises from outside. I know I had a classroom that every summer it would be quite warm in there, fling open the windows and get to a really complicated point in our exploration of a text. And then they would start the lawnmower going outside because we were right by the fields. And that distraction, that noise that was added to the environment was obviously, taking our processing, or taking their processing and my processing actually in this different direction as it kind of intruded. Now, that doesn't mean that a classroom needs to be silent all the time, but it's about making those choices. And so if we were doing something like think, pair, share, which I think has got a lot of value in terms of encouraging students to explore these ideas and think about them in another way, and perhaps challenge and have to explain to other people their thinking, the first part of that is the think. And that think, where they're thinking really hard about it, needs to be done in a very quiet environment, preferably for me a silent environment. So they would think about that carefully. Then all of the discussion needs to be focused on that. If somebody comes in and interrupts that and starts talking, then the discussion is going to lose that quality, and the load that's being placed on them is going to be distracting them from where they need to be. And so the divided attention, I think, is important. And I know there's been lots of controversy about, we can't control where students look and slant and those kind of ideas. I personally never felt the need to use a slant process in my classroom, but actually when I had students having to think hard about something, that couldn't be happening while they were looking outside of the window and looking in that particular direction. Some will argue that they can do that, and often I hear adults saying, well, actually I work better if I'm gazing out of a window, or I'm looking at a picture, or I'm listening to music, and all of those things, and that's fantastic for them. However, students generally, and we are talking generally, we've got 30 in our class, we want them to be thinking about the important things. So we can't afford to run that risk that because one student might work better by gazing out the window, that's going to work for all of our students. We need to give them the best chance. And I think dividing their attention by getting them to, or allowing them to look in other directions and think about these kinds of things that aren't relevant to the work they're doing, then that causes quite a problem. I know myself, when I'm reading over materials for my master's, when I'm looking at something like Julia Kristeva's work, I'm not going to be able to do that when I've got the radio on, when I've got the dog running around, when I've got, you know, lots of other things going through my head. I need to clear that space in order to do it. And I suppose another way of thinking about intrinsic and extraneous load might be your desk. And some people love that cluttered desk look. But the question is, you know, can our students cope with that cluttered desk, and what's going on kind of mentally for them around that? And that also means that the instructions and the information that we give to them, we need to think about how we're doing that. Suddenly mentioning when they're in the middle of a task, oh, in a few minutes' time, we're going to be doing this. All of a sudden, we're dividing that attention and we're placing that additional load on their thinking, and they're not thinking carefully about what we want them to think about. They're thinking about, well, in a minute, we're going to be doing this task. Or I've heard, you know, teachers very, very well-meaning, they will be giving some advice to an individual who's doing the task and everybody else is quiet, and they do that really loudly. Now, sometimes they do that without meaning to, but sometimes they will add an instruction, or they'll be talking to that student and they'll say it loudly, knowing that others will hear and it will act as a prompt. And actually that can take them away from the kind of thinking we want them to do. So thinking about layering up those instructions, those small steps, if we're going to think of it in terms of Rosenshine, can help to avoid that extraneous load. We want to make sure that everything we're talking about, though, links to it. And that's the same when we're thinking about the images that we use, or the diagrams, even where we position ourselves in the classroom can have an impact and create this extraneous load that we want there. The last one, that I think is really interesting is, you know, we can't actually control what's going on inside students' heads. All we can do is we can work to get them to focus on what we want them to focus on. But ultimately, if you know, I might be teaching a lesson, but actually thinking about shopping, or thinking about what I've got to do after this lesson because I've got lots of things to prepare, and we can't stop students doing exactly that same thing. What we can do is to try to control the variables that we can control. I think Graham Nuttall's work's really interesting because obviously he and his team were exploring what was really going on with those students, with those small conversations and interactions, what students thought was happening in terms of their own learning as well. And I think reflecting on that and looking at all of this from the perspective of the students in our classroom can be really important. So, you know, yes, that we can't stop them thinking about something else, but can we do everything within our kind of power to focus them in on what really matters? Now, a couple of examples of how I do this. I've got a do now task here. It doesn't have to be called a do now task. It could be starter, task one, whatever it is you decide students need to have there. And I'm always very careful in terms of where I position things on the board. I always make sure that a do now task is in the same place, that students will know to come in, that we have talked about the expectation of a do now. That means that hopefully after the first few occasions in my classroom, students don't need a reminder of what my expectation is. They will write their day down and they will do the do now task. They won't be needing me to be able to kind of lead them into this or to support them with doing this. They need to think really hard about it. Now, this could be 5 retrieval questions. It could just be these 2 here, but I've chosen 2 because I want this to be a crisp start to my lesson where they start to switch their thinking and think really hard about this. So what does Lady Macbeth suggest when Macbeth returns? That's linking to the prior knowledge of what we did last lesson. I've used the image of Lady Macbeth there because that was the production that we looked at, so it will be that kind of visual cue. They'll know immediately who we're talking about there. And what do you think Macbeth will do is a bit of a predictive task, so that's a bit harder. That's not just a case of retrieval, and I'm not saying retrieval is simple, but I'm asking them to pull together quite a lot of information there. So by asking them what do they think Macbeth will do, they're going to have to consider what they know about him already. They need to consider what they understand about the situation he's in. They need to perhaps draw on contextual information. And some students may well already know that. They may already have an idea of exactly what Macbeth does. But maybe then considering how they came to that conclusion would be a way to go. So what do you think Macbeth will do? And then I could simply add a why onto that to get those students thinking about it. But in terms of what they're thinking about with this task, I've really tried to focus them in. I want them to think deeply about this before we can move on to the next task. I want them to know exactly what the expectations are around this, and I want them to know where that do now task will be and what they need to do with that. So in terms of extraneous load, I've stripped that down. Now, the things I won't be able to quite control on the outside there is the person who's not sure where their book is, the students who are still coming into the classroom when that's happening, the fact that somebody's pen has broken or their pen has exploded. We get all of that, which is the extraneous again, isn't it? And the noise that's associated with that too. So again, it's about controlling what I can control in terms of getting them to really think about what I want them to think about. So how to support cognitive load, as I'm going into the next task, so I've got my do now task, I now want to do a little bit more reading with them. But in order to make sure I've supported their cognitive load, there are a few things that I will consider in order to get to that stage. So firstly, I think pre-teaching of vocabulary is important. I think tier 2 vocabulary in particular is important to consider. It's something we aren't necessarily always aware of. Again, as experts, as people with kind of wide vocabularies available to ourselves, we don't necessarily always consider what the tier 2 vocabulary is. We might be very aware of the tier 3, and the kind of complexities of the disciplinary language that we might be exploring with our students. But the tier 2 is important. So I want to explore next with them the Lady Macbeth, the Raven himself quotes himself hoarse, that particular point after the letter. So I want to perhaps pre-teach some of the vocabulary that they're going to experience with that in a light touch way. Before we get onto that higher complexity there. I said, use those routines. So we're going to be reading a text, a quick recap. So, what are we going to do? So we're going to read the text, we're going to be annotating, and we're going to be thinking about picking out these kind of keywords. So we would have done that a lot. When I approach a poem, for example, I know that I ask students to always consider the title as part of that. And so they know the routine, and that starts to become metacognitive. So they're thinking about what tools have I got available to me. We're going to be doing some reading. Miss has said it's going to be of a challenging task. A text, how do I do this? And so the metacognitive processes are starting to develop there, and then I will model that process with them. So I'm going to link to the prior knowledge in their schema. So I've said which section I want to look at with Macbeth, but we've already had the do now task, which we would have perhaps explored and discussed their thoughts on that. And a reminder as well that, what did Macbeth say he was going to do after he spoke to the witches? Well, he wasn't going to do anything. He was really surprised when he was to become the Thane of Cawdor. But he said, if chance may crown me king, he's going to sit back and he is going to wait. And then he wrote the letter to his wife. So clearly he didn't quite let it go. It was enough that he wanted to share with her. And Lady Macbeth has read that letter, and she now knows that Duncan's coming. So we've located that within the text. Now, some of that might have come with questioning. So in terms of, linking to their prior knowledge to support their cognitive load, students have had that opportunity to retrieve some of that information, recap some of that information, and to be able to put that within context. And I think that's really important when we're thinking about cognitive load. A phrase that people really use a lot, which I like, is the idea of sticky knowledge. It needs to stick to something. So we're building a schema around this text. We need to make sure that it links to that big picture there. We're going to strip out the extraneous load, so there's not going to be lots of text and papers and sheets and movement. I've thought about my learning environment as well, and we're going to be quiet when we're reading this text and exploring this text. There's going to be lots of questioning. There might be some discussion. There might be some think, pair, share that takes place in there too. But when we're reading, when we're thinking about this really complicated text, we are going to keep the intrinsic load our focus and not let the extraneous sneak in. My explanations are going to be clear and simple as I go through. So, and actually I'm going to stick with one question that we keep returning to, and the explanations of what I do, I will think very carefully about as we go through, maybe even planning some of that. Revisit the key points, and then keep layering the information. Okay, so what have we learnt about Lady Macbeth here? Let's recap that a little bit. Let's make a note of that on the board or on our notes or on our annotations, so that we're layering up that information. The complexity keeps building. The scaffolding around it, so the keywords, the pre-taught vocabulary may well be there, or some vocabulary again that we want to use that's academic language around this. So we might think about including the word symbolism, something we've experienced before and have knowledge of before. We could well recap that. So symbolism, metaphor, and put those again with the text, so that students have got that scaffolding to help them to think about it. All the way through, I'll be checking their understanding before moving on, before we layer onto that next piece of information. And I want to know from everybody. So, you know, there's no point me running ahead and not supporting their cognitive load by going too quickly. We want to make sure that the challenge is there, but we want to make sure that everybody has understood that in order to be able to move forward. And then I want students to do something with that information. This is, for me, where some of those generative activities come in. I may well ask them to do a summary before we start to get onto the even more complex points. So I might ask them to summarise what we learn in that scene. I'm asking them, therefore, to select information. I'm asking them to organise that information. I might ask them to explain to a partner what they've got there, and then we'll check against an exemplar. So we want students to do something with that information, to embed it, moving towards that bigger question. So my example here, just to give you a little bit more information, as I said, it is the Raven himself quotes the fatal entrance of Duncan scene with Lady Macbeth. I've got that one question there. What do we learn about Lady Macbeth in this extract? So in terms, again, of breaking down that cognitive load so that we are building it as opposed to overwhelming students with this already intrinsically complex task. I've pre-taught some of that vocabulary, so I've got mortal, diarist, compunctious up there, so they will be familiar with those terms. I've decided on the focus, so I've selected, I haven't got the whole scene there. Deliberate choice, because I want them to think really hard about Lady Macbeth in that particular extract. We've made those links to the prior learning and the big picture, talking about what has happened prior to this, thinking about Lady Macbeth already, and her initial reactions to what she was hearing in the letter. Lots and lots of questions and exploration and discussion around that, bouncing questions around, zooming in on different examples there. You know, the take my milk for gall, we could probably talk for about a week on the suggestions around that, checking their understanding at each point and annotating, as I say, in those agreed ways. One of the things that I do with extract work is, you know, we look for patterns, or we look to pick out 3 particular points that we're going to focus in. And then finally to do something with it. Now, as I said, it could be summary, it could well be actually answering that question using all that we've worked through there in order to be able to do it, perhaps with me modelling the starting point to scaffold again their processing, to give them those opportunities to think really deeply about the information they've got from this, and not necessarily worrying about how do I start the sentence when I'm answering this question. So I take away some of that, which I actually think at the moment is extraneous. I want them to be able to do that independently eventually, but a sentence starter which just allows them to be able to think really deeply about what we learn about Lady Macbeth in this extract, to think about the language that's being used there by Shakespeare in order to create that. That is going to be much more important than them worrying about what's the first word that I'm going to use. My model will help them to do that, or if I'm not going to model, the opening of a sentence or a few prompts to open their sentences will do that. So that's how I would then approach that task and explore that in such a way to make sure that I'm really thinking about the cognitive load, throughout. Remember, I don't want no cognitive load. I want them to be thinking really hard about it, but I want them to be thinking really hard about the most important things. Well, I hope that's been really useful. Just a few references which you might find interesting there. I mentioned that it's building on the multi-store memory model from Atkinson and Schifrin in '68. There's a really useful open access piece in the Chartered College about cognitive load in the classroom. I mentioned generative activity, so it would be silly for me not to say that perhaps have a look at the Fiorella and Mayer's Generative Learning in Action text that myself and Mark wrote. Ollie Lovell's superb Sweller's Cognitive Load in Action, which definitely, I'm just a novice in terms of this. He really knows his stuff there and how to apply it to lots of different areas. Love the Graham Nuttall Hidden Lives of Learners, and when we're thinking about things from a student's point of view, I think, just exploring that and considering what he saw and how, what that tells us about what's going on with our own students is really important. The Rosenshine principles, again, superb when we're thinking about our instruction and what we want students to be able to be thinking about at different points. The Sweller, and a huge shout out for Andy Tharby, who has got some superb ideas about how we can make sure that our explanations are really supporting students to think about the things we want them to think about in the most appropriate way. And there's some great work in there about the idea of metaphors, analogies, use of diagrams, and all of those other good things there. And of course, I mentioned Ollie Cav at the beginning with his particular picture of the multi-store memory model. I hope that has been useful and interesting. It would be good to share any of your own examples as well and how that's working for you in the classroom. Thank you.